I want to start with the moment I actually understood what was happening, because it wasn't when the siren started. It wasn't even when the boat pulled alongside us. It was a smaller moment than that, the exact second I looked down and realized I was still holding a champagne flute while an officer read me my rights, and some absurd, disconnected part of my brain thought, I should probably put this down. My name is Caroline. I'm 41 years old, and 8 months ago, I was arrested for grand theft, a first-degree felony, for taking my neighbor's $150,000 pontoon boat out on a lake for an afternoon with my friends. I want to tell you, honestly, up front, that what I did was wrong. I'm not here to convince you otherwise, and I've had 8 months of court dates and a very expensive lawyer to fully absorb that fact. But I'm also not here to tell you a simple story about one entitled, thoughtless decision on a sunny Tuesday, because that's not actually what happened, even though it's the version that made it into the police report, and it's the version I told myself for months afterward. What I eventually learned, deep into the legal process, through documents my attorney's investigator uncovered almost by accident, is that the boat wasn't simply sitting there, unlocked and unwatched, on the day I decided to take it. There is a version of this story where I was the only person making a choice that day. There is another version, one I didn't understand until much later, where I wasn't. This is the full story of how I ended up standing on a stolen boat in handcuffs, what I found out afterward about the man who'd been watching me long before that day ever started, and why understanding that didn't change a single legal consequence I still had to face. That I should tell you who I was before that Tuesday, because I think it matters for understanding how someone ends up making a decision this reckless, even though I know, now, that understanding isn't the same thing as excusing. I moved into Lakeshore Point, our development, 9 years ago, with my husband, Daniel, right around the time his consulting firm started actually turning a profit after years of struggling to get off the ground. Lakeshore Point was, and still is, the kind of community where the landscaping is uniform, where the HOA newsletter reads like a small municipal government's meeting minutes, and where your standing in the neighborhood is measured, whether anyone says it out loud or not, by things like which dock your family's boat is parked at and whether your lawn passes the quarterly inspection. I want to be honest about something that's taken me months of therapy to actually articulate clearly. I cared about that standing far more than I ever would have admitted at the time. Daniel's business had 2 genuinely terrifying near collapses in our first 5 years in that house, both of which we kept almost entirely private, presenting a version of our life to our neighbors and friends that was considerably more secure than what was actually happening behind closed doors. We refinanced twice. We quietly sold a car. There was an 18-month stretch where I found excuses to skip the neighborhood summer boat parade specifically because we didn't own a boat and I couldn't stomach explaining why, in a community where nearly every other family on our stretch of shoreline did. By the time of the boat, things had genuinely improved. Daniel's business was stable, our finances were no longer a source of constant private panic, but I don't think the anxiety from those years ever fully left me. It just changed shape. Instead of worrying about whether we could make a mortgage payment, I worried, in a way that feels almost embarrassing to say out loud now, about whether we still looked like the kind of family who belonged in a place like Lakeshore Point. My friend group in the neighborhood, a rotating cluster of 5 or 6 women I'd known since. We'd all moved in around the same time, had a running tradition of one big, memorable summer outing every year, a group trip, something worth photographing, something that would circulate in the group chat and on social media for weeks afterward. The previous year, another woman in our group, Vanessa, had hosted an elaborate day on her family's boat, and it had become, in the small, specific currency of our friend group, something of a social high-water mark. I remember feeling, that whole summer, a low, persistent pressure to eventually match it, to prove that our family, too, belonged fully in that world, rather than quietly scraping by at its edges the way we had for years before. I remember one specific evening, about a year before the boat incident, that I've thought about often since, because it captures something about that pressure more clearly than almost anything else I could describe. It was a neighborhood cookout, the kind of casual gathering where conversation drifts naturally toward vacations, renovations, the ordinary comparative currency of upper-middle-class suburban life. Someone asked, lightly, in passing, whether Daniel and I were planning to get a boat of our own eventually, now that things seemed to be going well, for his business. I remember laughing it off with some vague, non-committal answer, and then going home that night and lying awake for a long time, turning that single, offhand comment over and over, feeling a specific, humiliating clarity about exactly how visible our years of quiet financial struggle apparently still were to the people around us, despite everything we'd done to keep it hidden. I don't think I fully understood, at the time, how much that specific kind of visibility anxiety was still actively shaping my decisions. I understand it considerably better now, with the benefit of months of forced, uncomfortable reflection. I want to be clear that none of this explains what I did. It doesn't excuse it. But I think it's important context, because the decision I made on that Tuesday wasn't really about a boat. It was about a decade of quietly performing a version of security and belonging I didn't always feel, and a single reckless afternoon where that performance finally curdled into something criminal that I need to tell you about Mark now, because the version of him I understood on that Tuesday and the version I came to understand months later are, in some important ways, two different people. Mark had moved into the house next to ours about 3 years before the boat incident, a quiet, reserved man in his early 50s, recently divorced, who kept almost entirely to himself in a neighborhood that generally valued visible, performed friendliness. He waved. He was polite at HOA meetings. Beyond that, I genuinely knew very little about him, which, in hindsight, is a strange thing to admit about someone who lived 20 feet from my back door for 3 years. What I did know, or thought I knew, was that Mark and Daniel had a minor, ongoing property dispute that had been simmering, mostly beneath the surface, for almost 2 years. It centered on a section of shoreline easement between our two properties, a boring, technical disagreement about dock access rights that had, at various points, involved a survey, a certified letter from Mark's attorney, and, about 8 months before the boat incident, a formal complaint Daniel filed with the HOA alleging Mark had extended his dock structure several feet past the boundary our survey indicated. The dispute had, by that point, taken on a life considerably larger than its actual practical stakes probably warranted. There were HOA board meetings where the two of them sat on opposite sides of the room, deliberately not making eye contact. There was a period, roughly a year before the boat incident, when Daniel began keeping a folder of dated photographs, documenting the disputed dock structure, a habit that struck me, even at the time, as slightly excessive for a disagreement fundamentally about a few feet of shoreline. I remember, more than once, suggesting to Daniel that the whole thing wasn't worth the energy he was putting into it, suggestions he mostly brushed aside, framing the dispute as a matter of principle rather than practicality, a framing I now recognize, in hindsight, as its own version of the same status anxiety that was quietly shaping my own decisions during that same period. I want to be honest that I had, at the time, thought of this dispute as tedious background noise in our lives, the kind of low-grade neighborhood conflict that exists in almost every community, rarely escalating into anything that actually mattered. I didn't think about Mark much beyond that specific irritation. I certainly never imagined, at any point before that Tuesday, that he was thinking about us far more carefully, and far more strategically, than we were thinking about him. The Tuesday itself started ordinarily enough. It was the kind of flawless summer day that, in Lakeshore Point, practically demands to be spent on the water, dead calm, cloudless, the specific stillness that makes a lake look like glass. I'd made plans that morning with my friend group for something considerably more modest than what actually ended up happening, lunch on someone's patio, nothing elaborate. It was Vanessa, over text, who first floated the idea, half joking, that we should borrow Mark's boat for the afternoon, since she'd noticed, driving past our street the week before, that it seemed to sit unused at the dock more often than not. I want to be honest that my first reaction, even given everything I've already told you about the pressure I felt around that friend group's expectations, was to dismiss it as an obviously bad joke. It was Vanessa, again, who pushed the idea further, mentioning, almost in passing, that she'd heard from someone in the neighborhood that Mark kept a spare dock key in a lockbox near the boat's slip, for his maintenance crew, a detail that, looking back, I have no idea how she actually knew, since she and Mark had, as far as I was aware, no meaningful relationship at all. I've spent a considerable amount of time since that day trying to honestly reconstruct my own thinking in the hour that followed, and I don't have a satisfying answer beyond the uncomfortable truth that I wanted to say yes far more than I wanted to say no. Some combination of the perfect weather, the specific social pressure I'd been quietly carrying for years, and a genuinely reckless, in the moment certainty that we'd simply put the boat back exactly as we found it, gas tank full, no one the wiser, all of it converged into a decision I made far too quickly to have actually thought through. I walked down to the dock alone first, ostensibly to check whether the lockbox story was even true, though I think some part of me already knew, walking down there, that if it was true, I was going to act on it. The lockbox was exactly where Vanessa had described. I tried the code Daniel and I used for our own similar lockbox, which didn't work. Then, somewhat absurdly, I tried Mark's street address, a detail I only knew because of the ongoing property dispute paperwork sitting in a folder in our own home office. It worked on the first try. I remember the specific, brief pause I took after that lockbox opened, a genuine moment of hesitation, the last real opportunity one had to simply close it, walk back up to the house, and spend the day the way I'd originally planned. I didn't take it. I told myself the story I now understand was a lie constructed specifically to let me proceed, that this was borrowing, not stealing, that Mark would barely notice, that we'd have him thanked and the boat returned before he ever knew it had left the dock at all. I won't pretend that first hour on the water wasn't genuinely, uncomplicatedly wonderful, because it was, and I think that's an important, uncomfortable part of this story to be honest about rather than sanitize after the fact. The five of us, out on a boat that felt, in the moment, like exactly the kind of afternoon I'd spent years quietly wanting to be able to provide. We took photos. We opened a bottle of champagne someone had brought along for what we'd all assumed, going in, was an entirely ordinary boat day. There's a specific photo from that afternoon, one that later became evidence in my own case, that I still think about often. It shows all five of us laughing, sun-drenched, the lake stretching out gold and empty behind us, taken maybe 40 minutes before the siren started. I remember, looking at that photo months later during discovery, feeling a strange kind of vertigo, recognizing my own face, genuinely happy, in a moment I now understand was already being tracked, second, by someone who had very deliberately arranged for that happiness to be short-lived. I noticed, at various points, small signs that should have unsettled me more than they did, a moment where I could have sworn the boat's onboard display flickered with some kind of notification I didn't recognize, a brief buzzing sound from what I assumed was simply an old marine radio system I didn't know how to operate. I dismissed all of it, the same way I'd dismissed every earlier warning sign, because dismissing things had become, by that point in the afternoon, the specific skill keeping the day feasible at all. We drifted closer to a sailing club's practice race than we probably should have, laughing, oblivious, at exactly the moment, I'd later learn, that gave Mark his clearest, most damning footage of reckless operation. We cut through a no-wake zone without really registering what the small posted signs actually meant, focused instead on getting good photos with the shoreline. Mansions in the background. I want to be honest that none of this felt, in the moment, like the reckless, felony-adjacent behavior it actually was. It felt like an ordinary, carefree afternoon, the exact kind I'd spent years quietly wanting for myself. The first sign of trouble was a siren in the distance, faint at first, easy to dismiss as unrelated to us specifically. It didn't stay faint for long. Within minutes, I could see the flashing blue lights of a sheriff's patrol boat closing in fast, and behind it, unmistakably, a larger vessel with the orange stripe of the United States Coast Guard. I want to describe the specific, physical sensation of that moment, because I don't think I fully understood, before that day, how quickly panic can override every rational thought a person has. I remember Vanessa going completely silent beside me. I remember, absurdly, still holding that champagne flute, some disconnected part of my brain still trying to process the day as a normal social outing even as law enforcement vessels closed in from two directions. The sheriff's boat pulled alongside first, an officer ordering us to cut the engine, and I remember complying with a kind of numb, mechanical obedience that felt entirely disconnected from the person who'd confidently punched in that lockbox code a few hours earlier. Officers boarded. They asked for registration, for an operator's license, for any documentation establishing our right to be operating this specific vessel. I had none of it, obviously, and when they asked directly who owned the boat, I gave an answer I still cringe remembering, my neighbor. He let us borrow it, a lie so transparent, so immediately checkable, that I think some part of me already understood, saying it out loud, exactly how thoroughly this day was about to fall apart. A radio call confirmed what the officers clearly already knew before they'd even boarded. The vessel had been reported stolen hours earlier by its owner, who had, according to the officer relaying this information, provided its exact live location to dispatch. The ride back to shore remains one of the more surreal experiences of my life. Transferred from the boat's plush seating to the cold, hard deck of the law enforcement vessel, passing other boaters on the lake who'd clearly seen the entire pursuit unfold, some of them people I actually recognized from the neighborhood. I saw the handcuffs before I fully processed that they were meant for me. That's when I understood, completely, unmistakably, exactly how badly the day had gone that I want to describe what happened after we reached shore, because I think the gap between the glossy, cinematic version of an arrest and the actual, grinding bureaucratic reality of it is worth being honest about. We were transferred to a waiting sheriff's vehicle, driven in near total silence to the county processing facility, still in our swimsuits and cover-ups, still, absurdly, smelling faintly of sunscreen and champagne. Booking took nearly 5 hours. Fingerprints. A mugshot I still can't fully look at without a specific, visceral shame. A long wait in a holding area with 3 other women, none of whom I knew, while paperwork moved through a system that felt, in the moment, both impossibly slow and terrifyingly efficient. I remember calling Daniel from a payphone, an object I hadn't even realized still physically existed until I was standing in front of one, my voice shaking in a way I didn't recognize as I tried to explain, in the 60 seconds the call allowed, roughly what had happened and where he needed to come get me. I was released later that night on bond, into a driveway lit by the same porch light I'd walked past 1,000 ordinary times before, except nothing about walking up to my own front door felt ordinary anymore. Daniel didn't say much that first night. I don't think either of us fully had words yet for what had just happened to our lives. I hired an attorney, a careful, thorough woman named Patricia, within days of my arrest, and for the first several weeks, our conversations focused almost entirely on the straightforward mechanics of my defense, the fact that I had, undeniably, taken a vessel I had no legal right to operate, using a lockbox code I had no legal right to know. Patricia was honest with me from our very first meeting that there was no version of this case where the underlying facts of what I'd done simply disappeared. What she could work with, she told me, was context, sentencing considerations, mitigating circumstances, the kind of details that don't erase a crime but can meaningfully shape its consequences. It was Patricia's investigator, a methodical former detective named Ruiz, who first flagged something that didn't sit right with him during the discovery process, reviewing the marine security company's full records for Mark's boat rather than just the specific footage from that Tuesday. He noticed that the lockbox's access code, the one matching Mark's street address, the one I'd guessed on my very first try, had actually been changed by Mark himself just 6 days before the incident. Prior to that change, according to the security company's own maintenance logs, the lockbox had used a considerably more complex, randomly generated code that would have been effectively impossible for anyone to guess. Ruiz also found something else, buried in the boat's security app's notification settings, that took considerably longer to fully piece together. The vessel has left the designated zone. Geofence Mark had built into his tracking system had, according to the app's own configuration history, also been adjusted 6 days before the incident, narrowed significantly, in a way that guaranteed an immediate alert the moment the boat left the dock at all, rather than the wider, more forgiving boundary the system had used for the prior 2 years Mark had owned it. I sat with Patricia and Ruiz in her office the day they walked me through all of this, and I remember feeling a strange, disorienting mixture of vindication and something considerably darker underneath it, because what they were describing wasn't a boat left carelessly unsecured by a busy, forgetful owner. It was a lockbox deliberately reset to a guessable code, paired with a tracking system deliberately tightened to guarantee immediate detection. I'm precisely 6 days before the exact week I ended up taking the boat. Ruiz explained his process to me in more detail than I probably needed, but that I found, oddly, grounding during a period when so much of my life felt entirely out of my control. He'd requested the Marine Security Company's complete configuration history for Mark's account as a matter of routine discovery procedure, not initially expecting to find anything beyond confirmation of the theft itself. It was only in cross-referencing every time-stamped change against the broader timeline of the property dispute, something Ruiz described as standard practice in any case involving a pre-existing relationship between victim and defendant, that the 6-day pattern emerged clearly enough to be more than coincidence. He also pulled the HOA's full meeting minutes and correspondence file for the entire dispute, a process that took several weeks given the volume of documentation 2 years of increasingly acrimonious dealings had generated. Buried in an email exchange between Mark and his own attorney, sent the same afternoon the HOA ruling came down against him, Ruiz found a line that Patricia would later describe to me as one of the most useful, if legally limited, pieces of context in the entire case. Mark writing, in frustration, that he intended to make sure people in this neighborhood understand there are consequences for pushing things this far. A comment his attorney had apparently cautioned him, in a reply email, to be more careful about putting in. Ruiz kept digging, and what he found next was the piece that finally made the entire picture make sense in a way that genuinely unsettled me. 6 days before the incident, the same day the lockbox code and the geofence settings were both changed, was also the exact date the HOA had formally ruled against Mark in the ongoing dock boundary dispute, ordering him, in a decision Daniel had pushed for aggressively over the preceding months, to remove several feet of an extended dock structure at his own expense, a cost the HOA's own estimate placed at close to $11,000. Ruiz's working theory, one Patricia was careful to describe to me as circumstantial but genuinely compelling, was that Mark, having just lost a costly, months-long dispute with our family, had made a calculated decision in its immediate aftermath, not to bait any specific person into stealing his boat, necessarily, but to deliberately loosen his own security in a way that maximized the odds of catching someone from our immediate social circle in exactly this kind of reckless, prosecutable act. Given how openly, according to several neighbors Ruiz interviewed, our friend group had discussed and joked about the boats sitting unused at various points over the preceding months. I want to be honest about how I felt learning all of this, because it wasn't the relief I might have expected. It was something closer to a strange, disorienting grief, understanding that I hadn't simply made a reckless, impulsive mistake on an ordinary Tuesday, but had, in some sense, walked directly into a trap set specifically for someone in my position, by a man motivated by a bitter, months-long property dispute my own husband had aggressively pursued. Patricia was very clear with me, in the conversation that followed, about exactly what this discovery could and could not do for my case. It could not, she told me directly, form the basis of a legal entrapment defense, because entrapment, as a legal doctrine, applies specifically to government actors inducing someone to commit a crime they wouldn't otherwise have committed, a private citizen, however calculating or vindictive his motives, setting a trap on his own property doesn't meet that legal standard, and courts have consistently declined to extend entrapment protections to private individuals acting entirely on their own initiative. What Ruiz's findings could potentially do, Patricia explained, was inform sentencing considerations and, depending on how the prosecution chose to proceed, potentially factor into plea negotiations, since prosecutors do sometimes weigh the broader context of a case, even when that context doesn't legally excuse the underlying criminal act itself. I asked Patricia, directly, whether any of this meant I wasn't actually guilty of what I'd done. She was gentle but completely unambiguous in her answer. I was guilty. I had taken a boat that wasn't mine, using access I had no right to, and no amount of context about Mark's own motivations changed the fact that the actual decision to break into that lockbox and take that boat had been mine, made with my own hands, in a moment where I genuinely could have chosen differently. I want to tell you about the one conversation I had with Mark directly, which happened not in some dramatic confrontation of my own making, but during a deposition roughly 4 months into the legal process, where Patricia had the opportunity to question him under oath about the security system's configuration changes. Mark's answers, delivered in the same quiet, reserved manner I'd observed from him for 3 years as a neighbor, were carefully worded in a way that never quite admitted to deliberately baiting anyone, but also never fully denied the timing Ruiz had uncovered. He testified that he'd simplified the lockbox code because he'd been having trouble remembering the original, more complex one himself, a claim Patricia methodically picked apart by pointing out he'd used that same complex code without incident for 2 full years prior. He testified that the geofence adjustment was simply an attempt to improve the system's sensitivity following a minor, unrelated maintenance issue, an explanation that similarly strained credibility once cross-referenced against the maintenance company's own records, which showed no such issue had actually been logged around that time. I watched him testify, sitting a few feet away at that conference table, and I felt something I hadn't fully expected to feel, not primarily anger, though there was certainly some of that, but a kind of exhausted, mutual recognition. 2 people who had each, in our own separate, escalating ways, let a tedious property dispute curdle into something considerably more destructive than either of us had probably originally intended. Mark never directly admitted, under oath or otherwise, to deliberately engineering the circumstances of that Tuesday. But he also never offered an explanation that Patricia, or frankly I myself, found genuinely convincing. There was one exchange, near the end of that deposition, that I still think about more than any other. Patricia asked Mark directly whether he had any knowledge, prior to that Tuesday, that our friend group had been discussing or joking about the possibility of using his boat. He paused for what felt like a genuinely long time before answering, longer than any of his previous, more rehearsed-sounding responses, and said only that he'd heard things around the neighborhood, without elaborating further, an answer his own attorney quickly moved to clarify wasn't intended as a substantive admission of anything. I don't know that I'll ever get a fuller answer than that pause itself provided. In some strange way, I've come to find that pause more honest than anything he actually said out loud that day. The case ultimately resolved through a negotiated plea rather than a full trial, a decision Patricia and I discussed at length before I agreed to it. I pled guilty to a reduced charge, grand theft, but at a lower degree than the original first-degree felony charge, reflecting, in part, the context Ruiz's investigation had uncovered, even though, as Patricia had warned me from the outset, that context never fully erased the underlying culpability of what I'd actually done. Patricia walked me through the specific calculus behind that plea decision more than once, because I initially, in the immediate aftermath of learning about Mark's own conduct, felt a strong impulse to push for trial, convinced that a jury would surely see the full picture the way I now did. She was patient but firm in explaining why that instinct, however understandable, wasn't necessarily in my actual interest. A trial, she pointed out, would require me to testify in detail about my own actions that Tuesday, under direct, adversarial cross-examination, while Mark's conduct, even with everything Ruiz had uncovered, would likely be presented by the prosecution as legally irrelevant context rather than a genuine defense, meaning I'd absorb all the risk of a trial's uncertainty while gaining, in the end, very little additional legal protection beyond what a negotiated plea could already secure through sentencing considerations alone. My sentence included probation, a substantial restitution payment covering both the boat's minor operational damage and Mark's legal costs pursuing the case, a formal criminal record that will follow me for the rest of my life in ways I'm still fully coming to understand, and a court-mandated community service requirement I completed working with a local marine safety education program, a specific, deliberate condition Patricia had advocated for, given the reckless operation charges that had accompanied the theft itself. I lost my standing at Lakeshore Point in ways that extended far beyond any formal legal consequence. Several friendships from that social circle, including my relationship with Vanessa, didn't survive the fallout, partly because of genuine hurt and betrayal on both sides about who had suggested what, and partly, I think, because my arrest made uncomfortably visible a set of social pressures and performances several of us had been quietly participating in for years, in ways none of us particularly wanted examined that closely. That I want to spend a little more time on what that social fallout actually looked like, because I think it reveals something important about the specific world I'd spent years trying so hard to belong in. Within days of my arrest becoming public, a local news brief, then a wave of neighborhood group chat speculation that moved considerably faster than any official reporting, I watched the same community whose approval I'd spent nearly a decade quietly chasing turn, almost uniformly, into an audience for my humiliation rather than a source of support. Some of that reaction was, I fully recognize, entirely fair. I had, after all, committed a genuine crime against a member of that same community. But I also noticed something else, something that took me longer to fully process. Several of the same people who expressed the loudest, most performative outrage in the neighborhood group chat were people I knew, from years of proximity, to have their own private financial or personal struggles carefully hidden behind equally curated public presentations. It clarified something for me about the specific culture I'd spent years trying to succeed within, a culture built substantially on maintaining appearances, where my failure wasn't really that I'd broken the law, but that I'd broken the far more important, unspoken rule of getting caught doing so publicly and undeniably. Vanessa, for her part, distanced herself from the group chat conversation almost entirely once the story broke, offering no public acknowledgement of her own role in floating the idea that started the entire afternoon. I won't pretend that didn't hurt, though I've also had to sit with the harder truth that I was the one who ultimately opened that lockbox, and that whatever role Vanessa played in suggesting it doesn't shift the actual legal or moral weight of the choice I made with my own hands. Daniel and I are still married, still working through the specific strain this entire ordeal placed on our relationship, compounded by the discovery that his own aggressive pursuit of that boundary dispute had, whether he intended it or not, played a real role in setting the broader circumstances of that day in motion. We've since sold our house in Lakeshore Point and moved to a considerably more modest neighborhood, a decision that felt, at the time, like another loss, and that I've since come to understand as one of the healthier choices to come out of this entire ordeal. That I haven't talked much yet about what this did to my marriage specifically, and I think that's a part of this story worth being honest about, because it's the relationship that ended up carrying the most complicated weight once Ruiz's findings came to light. Daniel's reaction to learning about the 6-day pattern, the lockbox reset, the geo-fence adjustment, was not the vindication I think some part of me had hoped he might feel on my behalf. Instead, it was a slow, uncomfortable reckoning with his own role in escalating the underlying property dispute far more aggressively than, in hindsight, the actual stakes had ever justified. He'd pushed the HOA complaint against Mark harder than I'd fully realized at the time, driven by his own version of the same status anxiety I'd been carrying, expressed through a different, more overtly territorial channel. We spent several months in couples counseling working through the specific, uncomfortable recognition that our marriage had, in its own way, been organized for years around a shared, largely unspoken project of appearing more secure and more successful than we sometimes actually felt, and that. I haven't talked much yet about what this did to my marriage specifically, and I think that's a part of this story worth being honest about, because it's the relationship that ended up carrying the most complicated weight once Ruiz's findings came to light. Daniel's reaction to learning about the 6-day pattern, the lockbox reset, the geo-fence adjustment, was not the vindication I think some part of me had hoped he might feel on my behalf. Instead, it was a slow, uncomfortable reckoning with his own role in escalating the underlying property dispute far more aggressively than, in hindsight, the actual stakes had ever justified. He'd pushed the HOA complaint against Mark harder than I'd fully realized at the time, driven by his own version of the same status anxiety I'd been carrying, expressed through a different, more overtly territorial channel. We spent several months in couples counseling working through the specific, uncomfortable recognition that our marriage had, in its own way, been organized for years around a shared, largely unspoken project of appearing more secure and more successful than we sometimes actually felt, and that this project had, in its most extreme expression, produced a 2-year neighborhood feud on his end and a felony on mine. Neither of those things happened in a vacuum. They grew out of the same soil. Daniel didn't cause my decision to take that boat. I want to be unambiguous about that, because it would be far too easy, and far too dishonest, to let this story quietly shift responsibility onto him, or onto Mark, or onto Vanessa, or onto anyone other than myself. But understanding the fuller picture of how we'd both, separately, arrived at that Tuesday has been an important, if painful, part of actually rebuilding something honest between us since that we have 2 children, 12 and 15, and telling them what had happened, and why, was one of the harder conversations of this entire ordeal, made harder still by the fact that both of them had, by the time we sat down to explain it properly, already heard fragments of the story from classmates whose parents were active in that same neighborhood group chat. My 15-year-old, in particular, asked a question that I still think about regularly, with the specific bluntness teenagers sometimes have that adults spend years learning to soften around each other. She asked whether I'd done it because we needed the money, a question that, on its face, didn't quite match the actual facts of the situation, but that captured, with an accuracy that unsettled me, the underlying anxiety about status and security she'd clearly absorbed from years of watching how our family navigated that particular neighborhood, even without fully understanding the specifics. I told her the truth, as best I could explain it in terms appropriate for a 15-year-old, that it wasn't really about needing money in any literal sense, but about a kind of pressure to look a certain way to people whose opinions, in the end, mattered far less than I'd spent years treating them as mattering. I don't know how fully that landed with her at the time. I hope, over time, it will land more clearly than it did in that first difficult conversation that I don't tell this story to excuse what I did, or to suggest that Mark's own calculated behavior meaningfully shifts the responsibility for my own criminal choice that day. I made that choice. No amount of context about his motivations changes that fact, and I've spent months in therapy working through exactly why I need to hold that truth fully, without deflecting any of it onto someone else's behavior, however manipulative that behavior may have ultimately been. What I would ask you to take from this, if anything, is something a little more uncomfortable than a simple lesson about not taking things that aren't yours. It's this: the pressure to perform a life you don't actually feel secure in, financially, socially, in whatever specific way applies to your own circumstances, can quietly accumulate for years without ever announcing itself clearly, until it finally curdles into a single, reckless decision that feels, in the moment, disconnected from any of the years of pressure that actually built it. I didn't wake up that Tuesday planning to commit a felony. I woke up carrying nearly a decade of quiet insecurity I'd never fully examined, and it found its way out through the worst possible outlet on the worst possible day. I also want to leave you with something Patricia told me, near the end of this entire process, that I've thought about often since. She said that understanding why you did something destructive is genuinely valuable, worth pursuing honestly rather than avoiding, but it's only valuable if you use that understanding to actually change something about yourself going forward, rather than simply using it to feel less responsible for what already happened. I'm still working on living up to that. Some days I manage it better than others. I think, too, about Mark, more often than I probably should. I don't know if he ever fully processed what his own choices in the 6 days before that Tuesday actually cost him, morally if not legally. He got his boat back, his restitution, a legal outcome that fully vindicated him in every way the law is equipped to measure. But I've wondered, more than once, whether he's ever sat with the same kind of uncomfortable self-examination I've been forced into over these past 8 months, or whether the clean legal victory made that kind of reflection feel unnecessary to him in a way it was never going to feel unnecessary to me. If this story affected you, or if you've ever made a choice you can trace back to pressure you've been quietly carrying for years without fully naming it, I want to hear about it in the comments. I read every single one. And if you haven't yet, subscribe. There are more of these stories, and more of what I've learned since, every day.